The acid rain began without thunder, without warning. Just a low hiss against rusted metal rooftops and the distant crackle of something organic dissolving under a sky the color of corroded copper. And by the time the emergency sirens wailed across Dock Sector 12, most workers had already sealed themselves inside reinforced garages, sealing blast doors against the chemical storm that turned unprotected skin into blistered ruin within seconds. Marcus Hale was halfway beneath the engine cradle of a freight hauler when the first droplets struck the open loading bay, sizzling against exposed alloy like sparks from a cutting torch, and he swore under his breath as he rolled out from under the vehicle, wiping grease from his hands while scanning the yard to ensure no apprentice had been caught outside, because on a mining world like Carthos 9, storms weren't rare. But this one was different, denser, more caustic, the air itself smelling of scorched circuitry and melted insulation. As automated shutters groaned shut across the dock, Marcus caught something through the narrowing gap. A shape too pale, too still against the blackened concrete near the abandoned shipping containers beyond the perimeter fence, and at first he thought it was debris, maybe a tarp torn loose by wind, but then it moved, just barely, and a thin, broken sound cut through the hiss of acid on steel, a sound that did not belong to machinery or collapsing infrastructure but to something alive. He froze for half a heartbeat, knowing what lived beyond the fence in the wastelands between corporate zones. Dragons, feral and territorial, their numbers dwindling as atmospheric toxicity worsened each cycle, and corporate doctrine was clear. No intervention beyond designated safety zones, especially not during chemical storms. The shutters were seconds from sealing fully when the pale shape lifted its head, and Marcus saw eyes the color of faded silver. Scales not the usual burnished reds or obsidian. Blacks but ghost white, nearly translucent under the corrosive rainfall, and realization struck him harder than fear. It was a hatchling, small, skeletal wings curled inward defensively as acid streaked across delicate membranes, smoke rising where droplets struck exposed skin, and it was alone. "Seal the doors!" Someone shouted from inside the bay, and Marcus moved before logic could restrain him, slamming his shoulder into the emergency override panel, halting the automated closure long enough to dive through the narrowing gap, the first sting of acid biting into his exposed neck like fire ants burrowing under skin. Alarms erupted behind him, security warnings flashing red in his peripheral vision, but he sprinted across open ground toward the hatchling, boots splashing through puddles that hissed and steamed, jacket already pitting where acid began to eat through synthetic fibers, and as he reached the creature he saw the worst of it. Blistered scales along its spine, wing membranes, thinning under chemical assault, its internal glow so faint it barely illuminated the hollow beneath its ribcage. It tried to bare tiny fangs in defiance, but the motion collapsed into a weak tremor, and when Marcus scooped it up against his chest, he expected fire or panic, yet what he felt instead was freezing fragility, the hatchling's body temperature dangerously low despite the storm's heat, its breathing shallow and ragged. Acid burned through the outer layer of his jacket as he shielded the creature with his own body, turning his back to the rain while sprinting for the bay, each step a gamble against slipping into corrosive runoff that could melt through boot soles, and inside the dock his coworkers were shouting in disbelief as he lunged through the half-open shutters, rolling across the concrete just as they slammed fully closed, sealing out the storm in a final metallic shriek. Met suppression foam activated overhead to neutralize residual acid, coating both man and dragon in cooling white vapor, and Marcus lay there coughing, skin blistered along one cheek and forearm, cradling the hatchling whose pale scales were already beginning to show angry crimson lesions where acid had eaten too deep. "Are you insane?" his foreman barked, but the question felt hollow as everyone stared at the creature in Marcus's arms, its albinism unmistakable now under fluorescent lights. No pigment, no camouflage against the storm-dark world outside. A genetic anomaly in a species that relied on coloration for thermal absorption and territorial signaling, and perhaps that was why it had been abandoned, left to die where even its own kind would not risk exposure. Marcus staggered to his feet and carried the hatchling toward the maintenance wash station, shouting for distilled water, alkaline neutralizers, anything that could slow the chemical damage before it reached muscle tissue, and as crew members scrambled, some out of shock, others out of reluctant empathy, he laid the trembling creature on a padded tool bench, hands surprisingly gentle for someone accustomed to wrenching apart fusion engines. The hatchling's silver eyes fluttered open once more, focusing weakly on the human face hovering above it, and for a fleeting second Marcus thought he saw not fear but confusion, as if the creature could not comprehend why something without scales, without wings, would step into acid rain for it. Outside, the storm intensified, rattling the bay doors with relentless force, but inside a different tension took hold, the unspoken understanding that harboring a dragon inside corporate property, especially one visibly mutated and likely deemed unviable by its own species, would invite scrutiny, fines, perhaps termination of contracts. Yet as Marcus began flushing acid from fragile wing membranes with trembling but steady hands, he made a decision as instinctive as his sprint through the storm. Whatever consequences followed, this hatchling would not be abandoned. Again, and though he had rushed out thinking only of stopping immediate death, he could not yet imagine how that single reckless act would ignite a chain of events far greater than a mechanic's compassion, reshaping not only his own fate but the fragile balance between humans and dragons on a world already burning from the sky. The storm raged for 3 hours without pause, acid striking the bay doors in relentless sheets that sounded like sandblasters against steel. But inside Dock Sector 12 the focus narrowed to a single workbench where Marcus Hale and 3 stunned technicians fought to undo what the sky had tried to erase, and the albino hatchling lay trembling under emergency lamps while neutralizing solution flowed in careful streams across blistered scales, each rinse releasing a faint hiss as residual acid reacted and died. The damage was worse than Marcus first thought, because albinism in dragons was not merely cosmetic. Without darker pigmentation, their scales lacked optimal resistance to ultraviolet radiation and environmental extremes, and here on Carthos 9, where atmospheric chemistry was unstable from decades of mineral extraction, that vulnerability could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Patches along the hatchling's spine had already begun to ulcerate thin membranes, at the edges of its wings curling like burnt paper, and when Marcus adjusted the angle of a portable scanlight he caught sight of something even more alarming. The faint internal glow that marked a functioning fire sac flickered irregularly, as if struggling to ignite beneath layers of shock and chemical trauma. "We need to call Central Wildlife Control," one technician muttered, hands hovering uncertainly above a tray of sterilized tools. But Marcus shook his head sharply, because he knew what wildlife control meant in corporate language: containment, classification, disposal, and this creature would never survive a bureaucratic delay. Instead, he ordered the garage doors between bays sealed to prevent surveillance drones from catching a clear image, then accessed the diagnostic terminal usually reserved for engine schematics, repurposing its thermal imaging suite to monitor the hatchling's core temperature, and as numbers scrolled across the screen his jaw tightened. Its internal heat was dropping, not rising, the acid exposure having shocked its metabolic cycle into near shutdown. Dragons regulated immunity and healing through heat, and without a stable flame, tissue damage would spread faster than they could counteract it. Marcus scanned the room and made another decision that would earn him suspension if discovered. He rerouted a portable fusion welder's power pack into a low-output thermal emitter, rigging it with insulation panels to create a controlled warmth field, rather than a cutting arc, effectively turning industrial equipment into a makeshift incubator. The other mechanic stared as he positioned the emitter beside the hatchling, calibrating output so that warmth radiated steadily without scorching fragile scales, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the faint glow beneath the creature's ribcage steadied, shifting from erratic pulses to a dim but consistent shimmer. Hours blurred into meticulous care as they debrided necrotic tissue from the worst acid burns, applied regenerative gel stolen from the station's limited medical stores, and wrapped the thinnest wing sections in breathable polymer film designed for high-temperature pipe insulation but now serving as protective bandaging. When the hatchling stirred, a weak, broken chirp escaping its throat, Marcus leaned close, speaking in a low voice he didn't recognize as his own. Steady, reassuring, absurdly gentle for a man more accustomed to shouting over engines. And the creature's silver eyes focused on him again, this time with less confusion and more fragile awareness. The storm finally began to taper outside, leaving behind a world etched in corrosion, and with the immediate crisis past, new tension crept into the bay as corporate alerts pinged across internal networks, requesting status updates on acid exposure damage to company assets. Marcus wiped grime from his hands and typed a falsified report listing minor equipment corrosion and no biological incidents, knowing full well that surveillance audits would eventually contradict him. But buying time mattered more than compliance. By nightfall the hatchling's breathing had deepened, internal temperature climbing to survivable levels, yet it remained dangerously weak, and when Marcus attempted to step away for the first time, the creature's claw twitched, catching the edge of his sleeve with surprising precision, not enough to tear fabric but enough to anchor him in place. Something shifted in that contact, something heavier than responsibility, because he realized this wasn't just an act of rescue. It was a bond forming under circumstances neither species would have chosen, forged in acid and defiance. Meanwhile, rumors spread through the station's lower decks that a dragon had been smuggled inside Dock 12, and reactions ranged from outrage to awe, miners recalling stories of territorial raids years prior, while younger apprentices whispered about the rarity of albino hatchlings, considered omens in some circles and abominations in others. Marcus ignored them all, focusing instead on stabilizing his patient, though the reality loomed that even if the hatchling healed, releasing it back into the wastelands would be a death sentence, its pale scales offering no protection against future storms and no camouflage from predators. Near midnight, as emergency lights cast long shadows across tool racks, a security ping finally breached his falsified report. Upper management, requesting live feed verification after detecting anomalous energy usage from his bay during the storm. Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment, then reached out and powered down external cameras entirely, plunging Dock 12 into semi-privacy at the cost of triggering an automatic compliance flag, and behind him the albino hatchling exhaled a faint wisp of heat that curled into the air like fragile smoke, no longer the sputtering flicker of imminent extinction but the first deliberate sign of recovery. Marcus turned back to the workbench and adjusted the thermal emitter slightly higher, knowing that consequences would arrive with the morning shift. Disciplinary hearings, possible termination, perhaps even legal action for harboring classified wildlife, but none of that mattered in the immediate glow of that tiny flame. Because out there, beneath a sky that burned everything it touched, this hatchling had been discarded for its difference. And in here, inside a grease-stained garage meant for broken machines, a human mechanic had chosen to treat it not as a liability or a mutation, but as a life worth saving. And neither of them yet understood that the corporation watching through silent network logs had just marked Dock Sector 12 for far more than a routine audit. By the time the morning shift siren echoed across Dock Sector 12, Marcus Hale had not slept, and neither had the albino hatchling, though for the first time since he had pulled it from the acid rain, its breathing no longer sounded like something unraveling but something rebuilding, each inhale deeper, each faint internal glow steadier beneath bandaged scales. The improvised thermal rig hummed softly beside the workbench, its fusion core carefully throttled to maintain a consistent warmth. Field and Marcus sat on an overturned supply crate watching temperature diagnostics scroll across a repurposed engine monitor, knowing that the real storm was no longer outside but approaching through official channels. It arrived in the form of two corporate security officers flanked by a xenobiology consultant in a sterile white hazard coat, their boots striking the bay floor with the confidence of authority rather than curiosity. And when they demanded access to the sealed inner garage, Marcus did not pretend confusion. He simply stood, wiping oil-stained hands on a rag as if they were here to inspect faulty hydraulics instead of a forbidden life form. We detected unauthorized biosignatures and energy diversion during last night's storm, the consultant announced, voice clipped and clinical, and when Marcus stepped aside to reveal the workbench, the albino hatchling lifted its head weakly, silver eyes reflecting overhead lights like pale mirrors, and for a long, suspended moment no one spoke, because even those trained to view dragons as ecological variables could not ignore the fragility before them. Bandaged wings, acid-scarred scales. A body clearly too small and too different to survive alone in the wasteland. The consultant's initial reaction was detached fascination, murmuring about genetic recessions and pigmentation failure while activating a handheld scanner. But when the device registered stable metabolic recovery and measurable fire sac reactivation, the tone shifted from curiosity to calculation, and Marcus recognized the look. Value assessment. An albino specimen could be extremely rare. The consultant continued, already dictating notes about research potential, containment transport, laboratory viability, and Marcus felt heat rise in his chest sharper than any acid burn, because he had not dragged the hatchling through a chemical storm just to see it caged under fluorescent lights for dissection of its differences. "It's not cargo," he said flatly, and the lead security officer stiffened, reminding him that dragons on Carthos, 9 fell under corporate environmental jurisdiction, meaning the hatchling was technically an asset, not a patient, and therefore subject to relocation for study. Behind Marcus, the hatchling shifted, a faint tremor passing through its frame as unfamiliar voices echoed too sharply in the enclosed space, and without thinking he stepped between it and the scanning beam, blocking the line of sight with his own body. "It won't survive transport," he argued, pointing to the healing membranes and fluctuating heat readings that still required stable environmental conditions, and though part of that was true, another part was instinctive refusal to surrender it to sterile curiosity. The consultant hesitated, recalculating risk versus reward, and suggested temporary on-site containment under supervision, which meant surveillance, restrictions, and inevitable transfer once stabilized. Marcus countered with a different proposal. If the corporation wanted value, the hatchling's survival in an acid-prone environment could provide insight into atmospheric resistance and adaptive biology, but it would need gradual acclimatization, controlled exposure, and someone it trusted to prevent stress-induced relapse. The word trusted drew skeptical glances, yet as if on cue, the albino hatchling extended one small claw and hooked it lightly into the fabric of Marcus's sleeve again. A silent but unmistakable demonstration of attachment. Biometric readings spiked briefly from the scanner, registering a rise in core heat and synchronized heart rhythm at the point of contact, and even the consultant could not ignore the correlation. Reluctantly, a compromise formed. Dock Sector 12 would serve as provisional rehabilitation under corporate observation, Marcus placed on probationary oversight rather than immediate termination, and the hatchling classified as a conditional research entity, pending long-term evaluation. It was not freedom, but it was not a lab cage either. Once the officers withdrew, leaving behind discrete surveillance nodes embedded high in the rafters, Marcus exhaled slowly and turned back to the workbench, meeting the hatchling's steady gaze, and for the first time he allowed himself to acknowledge the deeper complication. Dragons were territorial and social creatures, and an albino hatchling abandoned during a storm likely meant rejection by its own kind, either out of superstition or survival calculus, and if word spread that a human mechanic was harboring it, tensions between dragon enclaves and corporate operations could ignite dangerously. That tension manifested sooner than expected, because 3 days later seismic sensors at the perimeter registered heavy wing beats approaching from the eastern ridge, and Dock 12's external cameras captured the silhouettes of 2 adult dragons circling low over the industrial zone. Their scales dark and unscarred by acid, their posture not pleading but assessing. Inside the bay, the albino hatchling sensed them too, lifting its head sharply, internal glow flickering uncertainly, and Marcus felt the air thicken with a choice far larger than corporate probation. Return the hatchling to a species that might view it as flawed, or defend its right to exist on human soil. When the adult dragons landed beyond the fence, claws carving shallow grooves into acid-pitted concrete, their eyes fixed. Unblinking on the garage doors, Marcus walked out alone to meet them despite security protests crackling in his earpiece, because some confrontations could not be mediated through policy. The larger of the 2 dragons spoke first, voice resonant and edged with restrained fury, demanding to know why a human sheltered what their own brood had cast aside, and Marcus did not flinch, replying that abandonment did not define worth, that survival in acid rain proved resilience rather than weakness, and that if they had come to reclaim the hatchling only to discard it again, they would have to step through him first. The silence that followed was heavy with ancestral pride and wounded instinct, yet beneath it Marcus sensed something else, not pure hostility but uncertainty, because the albino hatchling's survival contradicted assumptions about fragility, and perhaps even among dragons there were doubts about what difference truly meant, as wind carried the faint scent of chemical residue. Across the yard, the adult dragons lowered their heads slightly, not in surrender, but in contemplation, and Marcus understood that the outcome of this standoff would determine far more than custody. It would define whether compassion across species was defiance or evolution, and whether a mechanic's reckless choice in a burning storm would ignite conflict, or something far more transformative. The wind carried the sting of distant acid across the industrial yard as Marcus stood between Dock Sector 12 and the 2 adult dragons whose shadows stretched long across corroded concrete. And for several suspended heartbeats no one moved, because what balanced in that silence was not merely the fate of an albino hatchling but the fragile line between fear and change. The larger dragon's gaze shifted past Marcus toward the partially open bay doors where faint warmth spilled outward. And, when the hatchling answered with a thin, Wavering chirp from inside. Something ancient flickered in those molten eyes. Not rejection, but recognition of blood and bond. Yet pride warred with instinct, because among dragons of Carthos 9, survival had always favored the strongest adaptations against a poisoned world, and an albino scale pattern was seen as vulnerability in an atmosphere that punished the unshielded. It will not endure future storms. The second dragon rumbled, voice lower, less confrontational, more uncertain, and Marcus responded not with defiance this time but with evidence, activating a handheld thermal display projected outward so they could see the hatchling's stabilized core readings, the steady ignition of its fire sac, the healing progression of acid-scarred tissue under careful treatment. He explained the improvised incubator, the controlled acclimatization plan, the gradual exposure protocols he had begun implementing at dawn by rolling open the bay doors. For measured intervals while maintaining a buffered heat field, and though he expected dismissal, the dragons listened, nostrils flaring as if scent alone could verify truth. Behind him, security units watched from a cautious distance, corporate executives likely streaming the encounter through hidden sensors, calculating risk, liability, potential public fallout if dragon aggression erupted in a populated industrial zone. But no fire came, no lunging claws, only a long exhale of heated air that rippled dust along the yard. Then, unexpectedly, the larger dragon stepped closer. Not toward Marcus, but toward the threshold of the garage, and lowered its massive head just enough to peer inside. And there, on the reinforced workbench beneath engineered warmth, the albino hatchling met that gaze without shrinking. Its silver eyes did not carry shame, only wary hope, and when it shifted forward, wings trembling yet determined, a faint but deliberate spark flickered from its jaws. Not a defensive burst, but a declaration of life. The adult dragon's pupils narrowed, and Marcus realized that what they witnessed was not fragility but adaptation, because the hatchling's fire burned hotter than typical juveniles despite pigment loss, its metabolism compensating in ways even corporate xenobiologists had not predicted. It survived the storm unaided until he found it, Marcus said quietly, no longer arguing but stating fact. And that truth seemed to weigh heavier than accusation. Minutes stretched, then the second dragon spoke again, this time not in challenge but in measured tone, acknowledging that their brood had abandoned the hatchling, believing acid exposure would end it swiftly, sparing prolonged suffering and conserving scarce resources, and in that admission lay not cruelty but harsh environmental calculus. Marcus did not condemn them for it. He understood survival math better than most after years repairing equipment stripped bare by chemical skies. But he countered that survival was evolving, that humans had altered the atmosphere through extraction and industry, and therefore shared responsibility in ensuring that evolution did not become extinction for those caught in between. Something shifted then, subtle but irreversible, as the larger dragon drew back from the doorway and regarded Marcus not as trespasser but as participant in a shared ecosystem. The corporate feed crackled with urgent whispers in his earpiece, orders likely forming to secure the area before negotiations spiraled beyond profit margins. Yet before any command could be enforced, the albino hatchling made its own decision. It hopped clumsily from the workbench, bandaged wings flaring awkwardly, and padded toward the entrance, each step hesitant but intentional, until it reached Marcus's side. It did not pass him to reach the adult dragons, nor did it retreat deeper into the garage. It stood between both worlds, pressing lightly against his leg while maintaining eye contact with its kin. The gesture was simple yet profound. It was not choosing exile nor full return, but connection. The larger dragon lowered its head once more, this time touching its snout gently to the hatchling's forehead, and instead of rejection, a low harmonic hum resonated from its chest, a sound Marcus felt vibrate through concrete and bone alike, ancient acknowledgement layered with reluctant pride. It may remain, the dragon declared at last, voice carrying over the yard. But not as castaway. Teach it what you know of surviving this altered world, and we will teach it what you cannot. And in that statement lay an alliance no contract could draft. Corporate security bristled, but executives calculating long-term stability recognized opportunity where conflict had threatened, cooperative dragon-human adaptation studies, environmental restoration prospects, shared territorial protocols reducing future raids and retaliations. Marcus barely heard the strategic implications, because in that moment the albino hatchling leaned upward and released a stronger flame than before, bright and clean, illuminating acid-scored metal in radiant light. The fire did not scorch. It shimmered, refracting strangely through pale scales into a spectrum almost prismatic, as if difference itself bent heat into something new. The adult dragons unfurled their wings and took to the sky without hostility, circling once above Dock Sector 12 before disappearing beyond the eastern ridge, leaving behind not tension but a charged stillness full of possibility. Marcus knelt beside the hatchling, exhaustion finally breaking through adrenaline, and rested a hand gently against its warm flank, feeling steady heat where hours ago there had been only fading embers. Above them, storm clouds gathered again at the horizon, but this time he did not see inevitable destruction. He saw a future of preparation, collaboration, and resilience forged in the space between species. Dock Sector 12 would never return to ordinary engine repairs alone, and Marcus's probation would likely evolve into oversight of a joint adaptation program no one had planned, yet none could now deny. As the first distant droplets of another acid rain began to fall, they struck the reinforced roof with a familiar hiss, but inside the garage, beneath engineered warmth and growing trust, a once-abandoned albino hatchling stood stronger than any forecast predicted, proof that sometimes humanity's greatest strength was not dominance, nor technology, but the stubborn refusal to let a life fade simply because the world found it inconvenient.